Now here's the thing. I could end this story right there. The kiss, the bloom, the shoot breaking through soil. Roll credits, play the music, everybody goes home happy. But that's not what happened. Because the world doesn't let monsters keep their miracles. Not without a fight. And the fight that was coming for Kyle Ashenvine and Lyra Greymist wasn't the kind you could win with ancient blood or borrowed mercy or even the stubborn, reckless love that had dragged both of them out of their respective graves. This fight had teeth, and it was already at the gate. Believe me. 3 weeks after that morning in the tower room, Kyle was standing in the great hall of Ashenvane Keep, his hand flat on the table, staring at a letter written on paper so old it crackled at the edges. The seal was black wax pressed with the mark of a crown split down the center. He knew that seal. Every vampire on the continent knew that seal. The Conclave. 7 elder vampires. The oldest surviving bloodlines. The ones who had written the laws that governed their kind before human nations had borders, before wolves had packs, before the Thornwood had a name. They didn't visit. They didn't negotiate. They summoned. And when they summoned, you answered. Or, they came for you. The letter was 3 sentences long. The bloodline of Ashenvane has been corrupted. The wolf bride will be separated. You will present yourself at the Obsidian Court within 14 days. Kyle's jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his neck stood out. He didn't flip the table. He didn't roar. He folded the letter along its original crease, set it down, and placed both hands flat on either side of it. Then he breathed. 1 breath. 2. Lyra walked in. She was barefoot, wearing one of his shirts because none of her own clothes fit the way they used to. Her body was changing, not just the pregnancy, though that was part of it. Her wolf form had been dormant since the bonding, but her senses were still sharp. She could hear his heartbeat from across the keep. And right now, that heartbeat was wrong. What is it? He slid the letter toward her without a word. She read it. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her face didn't crumble. She set the letter down and looked at him and said, "No. Lyra, no. They don't get to do this. They don't get to decide. They're the Conclave. I don't care if they're the first 7 vampires who ever crawled out of a coffin. They don't get to separate us." Her hand went to her stomach. Instinct, protection, the oldest gesture in the world. Kyle walked around the table and stood in front of her. He didn't touch her yet. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the cold that still radiated from his skin despite the broken curse, the permanent chill that centuries of undeath had pressed into his bones. "I'm not going to let them take you," he said. "But I need you to understand something. If I ignore this summons, they won't send another letter. They'll send soldiers, Nightborn, the kind that don't negotiate, don't hesitate, and don't stop until the order is fulfilled. Then we fight against 7 elders and their armies. With what?" She grabbed the front of his shirt. "With everything. With whatever we have. You fought a curse for 400 years. I survived 6 months in a hole in the ground eating dirt and rain. We didn't do all of that to fold because some ancient bloodsuckers wrote us a nasty note. Get this. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either, and Kyle knew it. The Conclave wasn't just powerful. They were the framework, the system, the reason vampires hadn't descended into open warfare for the last millennium. Challenging them wasn't rebellion. It was pulling a thread that could unravel the entire structure of vampire civilization. But he looked at Lyra, at the fire in her amber eyes, at her hand on her stomach, at the woman who had clawed her way out of darkness and refused, absolutely refused, to go back into it. And he made his decision. "We go," he said. "What?" "We go to the Obsidian Court. Both of us. Together. But we don't go as defendants. We go as the Lord and Lady of Ashenvine, and we make them look us in the face when they try to tear apart what we built." Lyra stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Sharp. Final. They left the next morning. The Obsidian Court sat at the heart of a mountain range 300 miles north of the Thornwood, carved into the living rock by hands that hadn't been human for a very long time. The journey took 9 days by carriage, because Kyle refused to travel by shadow step with Lyra in her condition. 9 days of narrow roads through frozen passes. 9 days of silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't peaceful either. It was the silence of two people sharpening themselves for what was coming. Now here's what nobody tells you about the Conclave. They weren't evil. That would have been simple. Evil you can fight. Evil you can point at and say, "That's the enemy, let's go." The Conclave believed, genuinely, completely, in the marrow of their ancient bones, that the separation of species was the only thing preventing annihilation. Vampires and wolves had fought wars that burned continents. The laws existed because without them, everyone died. The Conclave saw Kyle and Lyra, and they didn't see love. They saw a crack in the dam. They saw a flood coming. And the worst part, they had evidence. History was on their side. Every recorded cross-species bond had ended in catastrophe. Territory wars, blood feuds, entire bloodlines wiped from existence. The last vampire-wolf bonding, 3 centuries ago, had triggered a conflict that killed 40,000 beings in 18 months. So when Kyle walked into the Obsidian Court on the 10th day, Lyra at his side, both of them dressed in the deep, black formal attire of House Ashenvane, he wasn't walking into a room full of villains. He was walking into a room full of people who believed they were saving the world by destroying his family. That's worse. Trust me on that. That's so much worse. The chamber was enormous. Cut from black volcanic glass, the walls caught light and threw it in fractured patterns across the floor. 7 thrones sat on a raised platform at the far end, each one carved from a different stone. Marble, granite, obsidian, jade, iron-veined quartz, basalt, and the center throne, bone, actual bone, fused and shaped and polished until it gleamed. 6 of the 7 thrones were occupied. The bone throne was empty. The eldest, Mordecai Voss, over 2,000 years old, the architect of the separation laws, the one who had ended the last great war by personally executing both the vampire and the wolf who had bonded. He wasn't in his throne. He was standing at the base of the platform waiting for them, a tall figure in robes so dark they seemed to drink the light around them. His face was narrow, angular, with eyes the color of dried blood. He looked at Kyle and Lyra the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. "Lord Ashenvane." His voice was dry, precise, utterly without warmth. "You were instructed to present yourself, not to bring the contamination with you." Kyle stopped walking. He was 20 feet from Mordecai. Lyra stood half a step behind him, not because she was hiding, but because they had agreed on this formation. Kyle would speak first. Lyra would watch. "Lady Ashenvane accompanies me, as is her right under the Charter of Bloodline Sovereignty," Kyle said. His voice carried through the chamber without effort. 400 years of authority packed into every syllable. "She is my bonded. She carries my heir. She stands where I stand." Mordecai's gaze shifted to Lyra. He studied her for 3 full seconds. A wolf, pregnant with vampire blood. This is precisely the abomination the separation laws were written to prevent. Kyle took 1 step forward, just 1. But it changed the geometry of the room. "Choose your next word carefully, Elder Voss. That is my wife and my child you're speaking about. I swear this happened." The 6 elders on their thrones shifted. Not much. A straightened spine here, a tightened grip on an armrest there. But they moved. Because Kyle Ashenvane, curse-broken and bonded, was radiating something that none of them had expected. Not rage. Not defiance. Power. The curse had been a cage. Everyone knew that. What nobody had calculated, what the Conclave had completely failed to account for, was what 400 years of compressed, contained, locked-down vampire essence would become when the cage was finally opened. Kyle hadn't just broken free of the curse, he had absorbed it. Centuries of darkness transmuted into something new, something that made the air in the chamber vibrate. Mordecai felt it. His left hand twitched, the first involuntary movement he'd made in probably a century, but he held his ground. "Your feelings are irrelevant, Lord Ashenvane. The law is clear. Cross-species bonding is forbidden. The penalty is dissolution of the bond and exile of the non-vampire party. This has been the law for 1100 years. It does not bend for sentiment. And if I refuse, then the penalty escalates. Destruction of the bond by force, termination of the hybrid offspring, revocation of your title and territory. Mordecai said this the way you'd read a grocery list. No cruelty in his voice, just procedure, just policy. Just the calm, administrative language of a system grinding a family into dust. Lyra's hand found Kyle's. She squeezed. He squeezed back. "I'd like to address the conclave," Lyra said. Every head in the room turned. Wolves did not speak in the Obsidian Court. Wolves were not permitted past the outer gates. A wolf addressing the conclave directly was so unprecedented that two of the elders actually stood from their thrones. Mordecai raised one hand, and they sat. He looked at Lyra with those dried blood eyes and said, "You have no standing here, wolf. My name is Lyra Ashenvan. I carry the blood of your oldest surviving lord in my body. If that doesn't give me standing, then your laws are even more broken than I thought." Here's the part that matters. Mordecai could have shut her down. He had the authority. He had the power. One word from him, and the Nightborn guards along the walls would have removed her from the chamber. But he didn't, and I'll tell you why. Because Mordecai Voss, for all his rigidity, for all his cold adherence to laws carved in stone before she was born, was curious. He had lived 2,000 years, he had seen everything, and he had never, not once, seen a wolf stand in the Obsidian Court and challenge him to his face. "Speak," he said. And the word dropped into the silence with the weight of a verdict. Lyra stepped forward. She let go of Kyle's hand. She walked until she was 10 feet from Mordecai, close enough to see the thread-thin scars on his face from wars fought before her species had a written language. "You wrote the separation laws because of what happened 3 centuries ago. The bonding that caused the Ashfall War. 40,000 dead. I know the history. I'm not here to pretend it didn't happen." Mordecai's expression didn't change, but he was listening, actually listening. "But here's what you missed," Lyra continued. "That bonding failed because both sides tried to use it. The vampire lord used his wolf bride to infiltrate the northern packs. The wolf alpha used her vampire husband to access blood territories. It was a weapon, a strategy. And when weapons break, people die. She took another step. 9 feet from the most powerful vampire on the continent. What Kyle and I have isn't a strategy. He found me dying in a hole in the ground, and instead of killing me or using me, he gave me a door I could close. He gave me the choice to leave. Every single day, he gave me that choice, and every single day I chose to stay. Not because of power, not because of territory. Because he was the first person in my entire life who treated my freedom as more important than his need. This is the part where I need you to pay attention. Because what happened next changed everything." Mordecai Voss looked at Lyra Ashenvane, and for the first time in recorded history, the eldest vampire's composure cracked, not dramatically. Not with tears or trembling, just a slight shift in his eyes, a fractional softening around the mouth. A change so small that only someone standing as close as Lyra would have seen it, and Lyra saw it, because she was a wolf. And wolves read faces the way vampires read blood, instinctively, completely, down to the cellular level. She saw grief. Old grief, ancient grief, the kind that calcifies into law and policy and rigid, unbreakable structure, because if you ever let it be what it actually is, pain, it would destroy you. Mordecai Voss hadn't written the separation laws because he feared cross-species bonding. He'd written them because he had lost someone to it, someone he couldn't save, someone whose death had hollowed him out so completely that he'd spent 11 centuries building walls to make sure it never happened again. To anyone, Lyra saw all of this in a fraction of a second, and she made a choice that Kyle later told me was the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed in 400 years of existence. She reached out and touched Mordecai's hand. The chamber erupted. 2 elders surged to their feet. Nightborn guards stepped forward, blades drawn. Kyle moved, fast, vampire fast, closing the distance to Lyra's side in a heartbeat, his body between her and the nearest guard. His fangs were out. His eyes had gone full black. Every ounce of that compressed, curse-born power was humming through him, ready to detonate. But Mordecai raised his hand again, and everyone stopped. Because even now, even with a wolf's fingers on his skin, his authority was absolute. He looked down at Lyra's hand on his, her warm skin against his cold. Wolf touching vampire, the exact thing his laws were designed to prevent. What was her name? Lyra asked. Quiet. Just for him. And Mordecai Voss, the 2,000-year-old architect of separation, the executioner of the last bonded pair, the most feared elder in the conclave, closed his eyes. Sarah, he said. Her name was Sarah, and she was a wolf. You could have heard a pin drop in that chamber. You could have heard dust settle. The 6 remaining elders stared at their leader with expressions ranging from shock to horror to something that looked, on at least 2 faces, suspiciously like recognition. They had suspected. Some of them had known. None of them had ever heard him say it out loud. Mordecai opened his eyes. They were wet, not with blood tears, the way old vampires sometimes cried, with actual tears, clear, human, the kind that hadn't fallen from those eyes in over 1,000 years. She died in the Ashfall War, he said. Not in the fighting, in the purge afterward. When both sides agreed that bonded pairs were the problem. When they hunted down every vampire and wolf who had dared to love across the divide. I found her in a field outside Veranoth. They had staked her through the heart with rowan wood, even though rowan doesn't kill wolves. They did it because it was a vampire punishment. They wanted to send a message. He pulled his hand from Lyra's. Gently, not with anger. I wrote the laws the next day. I told myself it was to prevent more death, more war, more fields full of bodies. He looked at Kyle. But it was grief. It was always grief. I couldn't save her, so I made sure no one would ever be in a position to try. Kyle stepped forward. He stood beside Lyra, shoulder to shoulder, and he looked at the elder who held their fate in his hands, and he said 5 words. Let us try, then. That was it. No speech, no argument, no legal precedent or historical analysis, just a request. Simple, direct. From one man who had found his way out of darkness to another who had been lost in it for 1,000 years. Mordecai stared at him. The chamber was absolutely still. No one breathed. No one moved. The Nightborn guards stood frozen with their blades half-drawn, waiting for an order that wasn't coming. And then Mordecai did something that hadn't been done in the 1,100-year history of the Obsidian Court. He stepped aside, not metaphorically, physically. He moved his body out of the path between Kyle and Lyra and the door. He stepped to the left, and he stood there, and he did not speak, and the meaning was unmistakable. Go, live, try. One of the elders, a sharp-faced woman named Thessaly who controlled the Eastern Territories, stood from her throne. Mordecai, the law clearly states. The law, Mordecai said, and his voice was iron-wrapped in velvet, was written by a man in pain. It served its purpose. It prevented wars. But it also prevented this. He gestured at Kyle and Lyra, at her hand on her stomach, at the 2 of them standing together in a place where no wolf had ever stood. And I am tired of preventing this. The precedent will be that the Conclave chose mercy, for the first time in its history. He turned to face his fellow elders. Vote against me if you wish. That is your right. But know that if you try to enforce the old law against these 2, you will have to go through me to do it. And I promise you, Thessaly, that is not a fight you want. Thessaly sat down. The vote was held in silence. Each elder placed a stone, white for dissolution, black for mercy, into a basin at the center of the platform. The count was 5 black, 1 white. Thessaly's white stone sat alone, conspicuous and outnumbered. The bond would stand. The child would live. House Ashenvane would endure. Cross my heart, that's how it happened. Kyle took Lyra's hand. They turned toward the door. and as they walked, Mordecai's voice followed them across the chamber. "Lord Ashenvane." Kyle stopped, turned. Mordecai was standing by his bone throne, one hand resting on the armrest. He looked old, not in the way vampires usually looked old, ageless, preserved, frozen in time. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just set it down. "Name the child after someone who deserved more time," Mordecai said. "There are too many of us who didn't get enough." Kyle held his gaze. Then he inclined his head. A gesture of respect so deep and genuine that two of the elders looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of it. They left the obsidian court as the sun was setting, painting the black glass walls amber and gold. Lyra didn't speak until they were in the carriage, rolling south through the mountain pass, the keep shrinking behind them. "Sarah," she said. Kyle looked at her. "If it's a girl, Sarah." His throat worked. His hand found hers. He didn't trust his voice, so he just nodded, and Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder, and the carriage carried them home. 7 months later, Lyra gave birth in the tower room of Ashenvane Keep. Not in the bed. She insisted on the floor, near the fire, because wolves labored on solid ground. Kyle had wanted physicians, specialists, an entire medical team. Lyra had wanted him, just him, and a clean blanket. The labor was 18 hours. I won't romanticize it. It was brutal. Lyra broke 2 of Kyle's fingers during the final push, and he didn't make a sound. He just held on and talked to her, low, steady, constant, the same voice he'd used through the bathroom door when she'd first arrived at the keep. The voice that said, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, you're not alone." The child came at dawn. A girl, small, furious, and screaming with lungs that were definitely wolf. Her eyes, when she finally opened them, were amber with flecks of dark crimson. Wolf and vampire, both and neither. Something new. Kyle held his daughter for the first time and his hands shook. This man who had fought wars, survived a 4-century curse, faced down the conclave without flinching. His hands shook holding a 7-pound baby. Lyra watched him from the floor, exhausted, wrecked, triumphant, and she said, "Say her name." He looked at Lyra, then down at the child. Then he said it, and his voice cracked right down the middle, and he didn't care. "Sarah. Her name is Sarah." Word traveled. Of course it did. You can't have a vampire-wolf hybrid born in one of the oldest keeps on the continent and expect people not to talk. Within weeks, the story had spread to every territory, every pack, every court. Reactions were mixed. Some wolves saw it as betrayal. Some vampires saw it as pollution. But others, more than anyone expected, saw it as something else entirely. Hope. Because if the Lord of Ashenvane and a trapped wolf could build something real, something that even the conclave couldn't destroy, then maybe the old walls weren't as permanent as everyone thought. Maybe the borders between species were lines drawn in sand, not carved in stone. Maybe the wars and the purges and the centuries of mutual hatred were a choice, not an inevitability. And maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to make a different one. Listen to me now. I want to tell you what happened at the 1-year mark, because that's where this story earns its name. Kyle had started something. After the conclave ruling, he opened Ashenvane territory, not to everyone, not all at once. But slowly, carefully, methodically, he began allowing wolves to settle in the border regions of his land. Displaced wolves, packless wolves. The ones who had fallen through the cracks, exiled, abandoned, lost. He gave them what he had given Lyra, a door they could close, space that was theirs, protection without possession. And in return they gave him something no vampire lord had had in 1,000 years, trust. Wolves working alongside vampire patrols, wolf hunters sharing territory with vampire scouts. It wasn't perfect. There were fights, misunderstandings, a brawl in the market square of Ashenvane's nearest town that left 3 wolves and 2 vampires nursing broken bones and wounded pride. But no one died, no one was purged, and every conflict was brought to the keep, where Kyle and Lyra sat together and listened to both sides and made judgments that drew on both traditions. Here's what nobody expected, It worked. Not because Kyle was a brilliant politician, not because Lyra was a natural diplomat. It worked because they had built something real between themselves first, a bond forged in darkness and sustained by choice, and that reality was contagious. People saw them together and they saw what was possible. Not a fantasy, not a fairy tale. A marriage, messy and difficult and real, between two people who had every reason to be enemies and had chosen, day after day, to be partners instead. Mordecai visited once, unannounced. He appeared at the keep on a winter evening, standing in the courtyard, looking up at the tower where light burned in the window. Kyle found him there, and didn't ask why he'd come. He just opened the door. Mordecai sat in the great hall and held Sarah for 11 minutes. He didn't speak. He just held her, this tiny hybrid child with her wolf amber, vampire crimson eyes, and he looked at her face with an expression that Kyle recognized because he'd worn it himself the first time he'd held her. Wonder. Pure, uncomplicated wonder that something this small could carry this much meaning. When Mordecai handed her back, he said, "She has her namesake stubbornness. Sarah used to look at me exactly that way, like she was deciding whether I was worth her time." Lyra laughed, actually laughed. And Mordecai, this ancient, grieving, iron-willed elder, almost did too. His mouth twitched. His eyes brightened for just a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting in just enough light to see by. He left before dawn, but he returned. Every few months, always unannounced, always alone. He never stayed more than a night. He never explained his visits. He just came, and he sat with Sarah, and he watched this impossible family exist in defiance of every law he'd written, and slowly, so slowly that even he might not have noticed, the grief in his eyes began to thin, not disappear. Grief that old doesn't disappear, but it changed shape. It went from a wall to a window, from something that blocked the world out to something that let him see it again. And if you think about it, really think about it, that's what Lyra did for everyone she touched. She didn't fix them. She didn't save them. She just stood there, alive and stubborn and present, and she gave them permission to look at the world again, the way Kyle had given her permission to look at herself. Now, I promised you a legend, and I'm going to deliver. 5 years after the bonding. 5 years after a vampire king found a wolf in a tree hole and made the impossible choice to help without owning. The Thornwood held a gathering. Not a summit, not a conference, a gathering. Wolves and vampires, and for the first time, humans from the settlements along the forest's edge. 300 people in a clearing beneath the oldest trees in the wood, standing together under a sky fat with stars. Kyle stood on a low rise at the center. Lyra stood beside him. Sarah, 5 years old, fierce, bilingual in fang and howl, faster than any child had a right to be, sat on Kyle's shoulders with her fingers tangled in his dark hair. He didn't give a speech. I want you to understand that. He didn't stand up there and make promises or declare a new era or any of that political theater. He just stood with his family and let people see. A vampire lord, a wolf bride, a hybrid child, alive, together, whole. And in the crowd, standing at the very back, half hidden by the shadow of an ancient pine, Mordecai Voss watched. He had a hand pressed flat against the bark of the tree, and if you'd been close enough you would have seen that his fingers were trembling. Not with weakness, with something harder, something that hurts more than any wound, hope, after you'd given up on it. Lyra saw him. Across 300 people and a clearing full of firelight, her wolf eyes found him in the dark. She didn't wave, she didn't call out, she just held his gaze for a long moment, and then she dipped her chin, just slightly, a nod, an acknowledgement. I see you, you're not alone. Mordecai dipped his chin in return. Then he stepped back into the shadows and was gone, but he came back. He always came back. That's the story. That's the whole story. A vampire king who was rotting from a 4-century curse. A wolf who spent 6 months buried alive in a tree, eating what the rain brought her, losing everything she was. A meeting that should have been a slaughter, a mercy that should have been impossible. A love that broke every law and every book and survived anyway because both of them, chose it, every day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. And an old man with dried blood eyes who learned at 2,000 years old that the walls he'd built to keep out pain were also keeping out everything else. Here is the truth of it, and I will tell you this for free. The legend isn't the bonding. The legend isn't the conclave ruling. The legend isn't even Sarah, though she grew up to be something the world had never seen before. A bridge between species, a living proof that the old borders were imaginary. The legend is the tree, that old oak in the thornwood with the split trunk and the sealed hollow. Kael had it declared protected ground in the first year. No one was allowed to cut it, no one was allowed to build near it. It just stood there in its clearing growing. And from the roots of that tree, the same roots that had once trapped a wolf and held her in darkness for 6 months, a grove began to spread. New trees pushing up through soil that hadn't grown anything in centuries. Green things, living things fed by the same root system that had once been a prison. The hollow where Lyra had been buried was sealed shut with golden pine sap, a scar in the bark that hardened into something almost beautiful. And every spring, the tree bloomed, white flowers, wolf-white. They lasted exactly 6 days, one for each month she'd spent in the dark, and then they fell, and the tree was just a tree again, until the next spring. Locals started calling it the Mercy Oak. Wolves left offerings at its base. Vampires, who normally had no interest in living wood, would stop and stand beneath its branches and feel something they couldn't name. Something old. Something warm. Something that felt, if you held still long enough, a whole lot like a second chance. What happened in the years after that gathering would become Thornwood legend, a story whispered about for decades. How the borders softened. How the first mixed settlements grew up along the forest's edge. How a vampire lord and a wolf walked through the world side by side and made it bigger just by existing in it together. How their daughter ran through the trees with amber crimson eyes and laughed in 2 languages and feared nothing because she had never been taught that fear was required. And how, once a year on the anniversary of the day Kael found Lyra in that tree, the Lord of Ashenvan walked into the Thornwood alone. He went to the Mercy Oak. He put his hand on the sealed hollow. And he stood there in silence for exactly 1 hour, remembering what it felt like to find something worth saving and making the terrifying, irreversible decision to save it. Not because he had to, because he chose to. And because a wolf, trapped and starving and broken, had looked up at a monster with blood on his mouth and seen a man. That's the legend. That's the whole legend. And I swear on everything I've ever told you, every word of it is true. If this story hits you where you live, you know what to do. Subscribe, tap that notification bell, drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done at that tree? Would you have walked past? Would you have stopped? Would you have had the guts to help something that could bite you? Be honest. I want to know. And share this with someone who's in their own tree right now. Someone stuck. Someone in the dark. Someone who's forgotten what it feels like to have a door they can close and a choice they can make. Send them this story. Remind them that 6 months in a hole doesn't have to be the end. Sometimes it's just the part before the beginning. I'll see you in the next one.